lovely to see you all today. I love it when they let me out of the office because, it's nice to sort of see the fresh air and find out that there are normal people in the world. I spend a lot of my day reading activists, so it's really good fun to come and share with you some of the uplifting results of my research. A little while ago, Martin wrote a blog entitled, "They Are Coming for Your Children." And it sparked a bit of comment among some of our supporters. Some people felt that it might be a tad alarmist. So I'm going to spend the next little while explaining why. You'll see from the title of my talk, which is called "Recruiting Children to the Queer Revolution," I'm doubling down on Martin's message, and I'm just going to explain to you why we believe what we believe. Because if we look at safe schools, or we look at respectful relationships, or any of these issues and policies that are cropping up in government, we miss the big picture. So what I'm going to do is spend a little while just panning back and telling you how the activists see the world. And when you understand the architecture of their ideology, their sort of quasi-religious belief system, then suddenly the words that they're speaking become clearer and their real meaning comes into focus. So it might be a bit messy, but let's see how we get on. If we look at activists, who are these people and what do they want? So activists come in many different shapes and sizes. And broadly speaking, I'm going to look at two groups. There are sexual rights activists who advocate for sexual liberty for everyone. Homosexual rights activists are just one part of this group. It also includes lobbyists for the sex industry, advocates for polyamory and pedophilia. So these people, who follow the work of Dr. Alfred Kinsey from the 1940s and 50s, believe that sex in itself is never damaging. The problem only comes in because we as a society have shrouded sexuality in this false morality. We've decided arbitrarily that some sexual behaviours are good and that some are bad. And this moral framework is socially constructed, so it can all be deconstructed. And according to this view, sexual bad behaviour doesn't cause any problems, but stigma does. So morality, it creates both the permission structure for sexual hedonism, but also the weaponry to turn on those that criticise it. So if you are one of those people who think that sex should ideally be connected to love, that monogamy is a good thing and that sex with children is always harmful to them, well then you are just one of those nasty moralists who is contributing to the problem and making it worse. The answer, they believe, is just to celebrate sexual diversity and support sexual agency everywhere and for everyone. Now, some of those are fairly shocking beliefs. If I had longer, I probably would spare you the evidence, but I've given it to other people and it's not very comfortable, but it's there. It's important to distinguish between people with same-sex attraction and the activists, because there are many, many people who identify as homosexuals or bisexuals who do not share either the worldview or the political aspirations of these activists. And during the same-sex marriage campaign, it was all presented as an issue of including same-sex attracted people within the existing social order. Well, that's not what these activists are about at all. They object to what they call the politics of respectability. They want to smash up the existing social order. They do not want to be included in it. So then the second group that I'll look at is transgender rights activists. These include, again, a mix of people, transgender adults who believe they are a man in a woman's body or the other way around, transvestites who just like to monkey around with gender expression, and you would include drag kings and queens in that group. There are gender-fluid, non-binary types who typically have degrees in gender studies and think that Judith Butler is really cool. And now there's a wave of transgender kids as well, and their mothers who have joined in the struggle for transgender rights, and I'll come back to them in a moment. But for now, I just want to point out that, there's a kind of party bag of activists here. There are all sorts of different people, pick and mix, but what they're unified in is a common worldview which is informed by Marxist theory, by postmodernism, theories of social construction, and relativism. All lots of big words, but basically what it means is that there is no absolute truth. Truth is just a weapon that some people use to beat up other people. Everything is socially constructed. It's been arranged in a certain way to privilege certain elites, particularly cisgender heterosexual white males, and liberation requires that we overthrow the source of their privilege by eradicating heteronormativity. So heteronormativity, another big word, but I'll explain that too. If you haven't heard of it before, it is an oppressive ideology which is constructed by our capitalist overlords. So Ros Ward, who is the co-author of the Safe Schools program, as we heard, in her address to the Marxism 2015 conference explained heteronormativity this way: To smooth the operation of capitalism, the ruling class has benefited and continues to benefit from repressing our bodies, relationships, sexuality, and gender identities. Alongside sexism, homophobia and transphobia both serve to break the spirits of ordinary people, to consume our thoughts, to make us accept the status quo, and for us to keep living and aspiring to live or feel like we ought to live in small social units and families where we must reproduce and take responsibility for the people in those units. So anyone here who thought that they were male or female just on account of their bodies, and those people who are attracted to the opposite sex just because they were set up for it by their parents, are really all oppressed. And if that's you, well, the good news is that the queer revolution is here to liberate you. Really, whether you like it or not. And Nivo Zissen, who was the poster child for safe schools but is now an early career activist, tells us that the queer revolution is not just coming, it is here. It has arrived. So that's the activist's worldview. If you feel that you've wandered into this strange alternative reality and you're now feeling thoroughly disoriented, you've got a little glimpse of my working day. We're on the right track. And I'm sorry that I have to shove a lot of unfamiliar concepts at you without really giving you much of a chance to digest them, but it's important at least that you have a rough idea, rough coordinates of the activist's worldview before we launch forth and examine what they think about parenting. So when Scott Morrison commented recently that we should just let kids be kids, the activist social media pages lit up with this strange kind of furious agreement. Yes, we should all let kids be kids, because they believe that if we just let kids be kids, if we allowed them to be truly free, if we didn't stuff them into little heteronormative boxes and punish them for being different, then they would all naturally be queer. We think they're foisting queer ideology onto our children, but they think we're foisting heteronormativity onto them. So any self-respecting revolution knows that the way to change a society is to influence the children, because they are the future. So you need to educate children out of heteronormativity, which is what they try to do in schools now, of course. But more than that, they want to change the way we parent, because ideally, if children don't learn it in the first place, then they don't have to unlearn it. So they need to stop us from foisting heteronormativity onto children. And if heteronormativity is oppressive, then parents who impose it on their children are abusive. And this is what I want to tap into. According to the activist worldview, a child, and only a child, knows who they really are. They both discover and reveal this as they grow. And important aspects of their identity include gender and sexuality. And the job of good parents is to create a sort of bubble around the child, which is devoid of any assumptions regarding any of these things, so that the child is free to develop and express themselves without constraint. And this is where the role of the liberal feminist mothers of transgender children is significant. And again, I'm not talking about mothers of transgender children generally, I'm just talking about the activists. And I'll tell you about them now. So this piece of the puzzle really only fell into place for me a couple of weeks ago. I was listening to a TEDx talk by Dr. Margaret Nichols, who is a lesbian counsellor to the LGBT community in New Jersey. And she was explaining that the women to start support groups for transgender kids were mums who are feminists, or the daughters of feminists. And these are the mums that believed all that freedom to be you and me stuff. They believed in breaking down gender roles. These are the mums that got trucks for their little girls and dolls for their little boys. And then, when some of their kids went a little further than they had expected, and instead of just being gender non-conforming, they came out as transgender, well, these are the mums that kind of took a deep breath and pivoted. And they're behind their kids 110%. These are the mums that are changing the laws. They're forcing schools to be different. They're educating their families, their friends, their communities. And I tell you, it's not easy for them. It's difficult to accept having a transgender child. It's scary, it's confusing, it's new. You don't know what's going to happen to that kid. But these mums suck up their own pain and deal with it so that they can support their transgender kids. In my book, these mums are heroes. So that was what she said. Are these mums just more enlightened, more selfless, more progressive in their parenting and more wholeheartedly committed to their children than other mums? Because this is certainly what we are supposed to believe. Or are they using their children as a vehicle to show off their own politically liberal credentials? This is a horrible thing to say. As a mother, I don't like to criticise other mothers. But if you make a study of the famous transgender kids and baby drag queens, it's striking to note that they all have cheerleader mothers. And if I had more time, I could show you clear evidence that these kids progress into genderlessness not from freedom that comes from a bubble devoid of guidance, but because they found that it drew praise and attention from their mothers. So just to give you a quick example, I don't think any 9-year-old rips up posters of Donald Trump from their own independent assessment of the American political situation. I'm willing to lay odds that that kid's mother does not vote Republican. So a great deal of what you think about parenting turns on what you think the job of a good parent is. Are we trying to help our kids to live in the world and become responsible citizens? Or are we wanting them to change the world and using our children as the force for that change? So conservatives would answer it one way and liberal progressives would answer another way. In 2017, Benjamin Law, who is famous for other things as well, wrote an apologetic for the Safe Schools program called Moral Panic 101, in which he gave us all the benefit of his advice about what parents ought to do. And he said this: even before they're verbal, children can communicate to us what they need, what makes them happy, what makes them upset. And in response, parents are instinctively compelled to make things better, to make them happy. However, handing over agency to a child to express and forge their own happiness can be a heart-tearing experience for adults. The last thing anyone wants for their child is to make imperfect decisions like the ones we've made for ourselves, especially about anything fundamental and lifelong, like mastectomies, for example. However, as children become adults, they will assert themselves as they wish, whether their parents like it or not. Our instinct is to stop them before they hurt themselves, no matter what age they are. But what is it to live in a world without agency? What is it to live in a world seen exclusively through the lens of those around you and not as you truly see yourself? Is that a life worth living? So when I first read this, I thought Law was just being naive, because he seems to suggest that we should treat our teenagers just the same way that we treat infants, that we just give them everything they want. And that seemed to me both unrealistic and most unwise if you want your child to be the sort of person that other people like too. So I was inspired to write a blog called Parenting 101, in which I explained my view of what good parents were, and that they were the ones who applied themselves diligently to the task of helping their children to grow into strong, resilient, independent, reliable adults. Giving them everything they want will not produce those results. So I've been revisiting my thoughts on this recently, and I realised that since Marxists are ambivalent about power, that this also extends to parental power, parental authority over their children. So again and again you find the activists describing only two types of parent: good parents who are complete doormats for their small tyrannical offspring, or nasty, oppressive, authoritarian, overbearing parents who stifle the life out of them. And I know a lot of parents, and none of them fit into either of those categories. Most parents, whether you think they get it right or not, simply apply themselves to working for their child's good. And they use their parental authority, although very often not in ways that their children are immediately grateful for, to lovingly provide everything that their child needs. And that includes guidance, advice, protection, and discipline. And one thing that parents are known for generally is selflessness. Opposite thing, it's there. I'm living in two worlds so often, left brain, right brain. So what Mr. Law tells us is that since the queer revolution is all about the best interests of children, that parents who don't roll over smartly to its demands must not really love their children. And then he suggests that such parents have superior commitment to their own comfort. It's too much work for them to change their minds about heteronormativity. They would rather see their children suffer terribly than go to such an effort. And this is a gross injustice to parents, of course. But this isn't just what the activists tell us, it's what the activists tell children. And I hadn't really understood this until I spoke to a few mothers whose children had been affected. So we hear the words homophobic and transphobic bandied around so liberally that it's really easy to miss how these words land on the ear of a teenager who has just declared an LGBT identity. But just imagine for a moment that you are 14 years old and you have formed the belief that you are transgender, you are bisexual. This is just part of who you really are. It's essential and unchangeable to who you are. And you're told that anyone who really loves you will just accept this without question. And then if your parents hesitate to celebrate and confirm you in these discoveries, then the activists will tell you that they are transphobes and homophobes. And what the child hears then is that their own parents, these people who are supposed to love them more than anyone else in the world loves them, these people who are their principal support in life, actually hate who and what they are. Their hatred for transgender people or bisexuals is greater than their love for their own child. What monsters they must be. And this is such a heartless, terrible thing to tell to a child. But then, can I have the next slide? Then in contrast, so this is the picture that we're given here, these poor children suffering. And then in contrast, here is the queer community with loving arms open wide, telling them that we are your queer family. You are loved. We understand who you really are. Your parents don't define you, and we love you unconditionally. Your parents are heteronormative bigots who are trying to oppress you and limit your choices. They're not treating you like the mature, independent person that you really are. And this then plays to the vulnerability of unstable kids, and it weaponizes the age-old problem of teenage rebellion. Just at the moment of greatest vulnerability, these activist organisations are inserting themselves between a parent and child and eroding that trust that the parent relies on to have any influence with their child. So they're alienating the parent from the child. And where this would be recognised as grooming if it were done by a sexual predator working alone, here it is done by activists working in concert, and not for the purposes of personal sexual exploitation of children, but to recruit them to the queer revolution. And these activists have positions of authority in schools, so parents who don't want to be distanced from their children entirely must go along with the activist agenda. And think about that from a child's point of view. If you're in school and you've been told all of this stuff and the whole adult world is agreeing with you against your parents, then of course you're going to begin to think that there's something wrong with your parents, so that your parents really are abusive. And this is how the support that is offered to LGBT kids in schools works to reduce a parent's ability to resist, even if they wish to. I'm going to read you an excerpt that has been given to me to read with permission by one of the Melbourne mothers here, who's been talking to me about her experiences with her daughter in safe schools. She says, "It was a perfect storm when safe schools entered our life. My daughter was only 14 years old and already vulnerable from a past trauma. The timing could not have been worse. She was fast-tracked towards the -18 community and the school standout group via the school counsellor, and then with the backup of the principal, various teaching staff, and remarkably, the local town council youth officers, because they care about kids. And parents at the school were given no forewarning that the school had joined the Safe Schools Coalition or what that would mean. I had to drop her off at the adult gay nightclubs where -18 dances were held. My noblest parental instinct screamed out in despair that my child was being prematurely sexualised by a niche subculture that parents would normally try to shield and protect our children from. There were no firewalls between her and the people who were pushing some highly sexualised concepts. They saw nothing wrong with exposing children to completely inappropriate ideas, devices, and practices. Some friends and family were shocked that I allowed her to attend, but the reality is that I was not afforded the space to express my concerns. My daughter was depressed, and everyone agreed that her safety depended absolutely on hastening to celebrate her newly proclaimed sexual identity. So her safety was really weaponised against me and my reasonable wishes to shelter her from being immediately categorised and introduced into the LGBT nightclub culture and community were silenced and overridden. The parents that activists characterise as abusive are really just ordinary mums and dads who are sensibly conservative when it comes to their children's safety. So it's either support your child in whatever the activist agenda says is necessary for your child, or you have to let the activists take over and do it for themselves. And apparently they are so committed to the idea that they have got it right, that they understand what LGBT kids really need, that they feel completely justified in reaching around parents to help Victoria's LGBT oppressed kids, even without their parents knowing it. So, for example, listen to this passage from Benjamin Law's Moral Panic 101, in which he describes his visit to -18's same-sex formal. As the dance floor winds down, a female couple, Asian, Australian and shy, tell me that it's best not to use their real names as neither of their parents know that they're here or that they're an item. It's the same story for many of the 50 teenagers from Geelong and 20 from Shepparton who've been bussed in by their local queer youth groups. Many need to be home by a certain time so that their parents don't suspect where they've been. For many of the young people here tonight, neither home nor school is safe. So for Law, apparently, there's nothing sinister in the idea that the queer youth groups of Shepparton and Geelong are bussing kids into parties in the city without their parents knowing about it. The problem, as he sees it, is that these queer youth groups have to go to these extraordinary lengths to keep the parents in the dark and to make sure they don't find out. The activists are the goodies who really love the children, while home, on the other hand, is not safe. So what have these parents done to deserve this assessment of not safe? Have they taken to their children with a baseball bat and locked them in the cellar? The only thing you could say against these parents is that if they had been asked, which they haven't, they may have had some objection to their children going to a -18 party. And if you know what I know about the history of -18 parties, you might feel that parents have good reason for wanting their kids to stay home. And then we have Facebook posts from Micah Scott, who's the CEO of -18, saying that from his point of view, it's an advantage that they can now offer free tickets to the formal, because before kids had to ask their parents for the money and that was an issue, whereas now they can come without anybody knowing about it. And you'll remember articles from -18's website teaching kids in how to hide their browsing history so that their parents don't find out. They organise clothing exchanges so that trans kids can get breast binders, for example, and they don't have to ask their parents for the money. And the activists see all of this as virtuous because it's helping to protect kids from their abusive parents. And already government's policy is supporting the activists' worldview over ordinary parents. So I've highlighted elsewhere how the Victorian Department of Education and Training allows children to be transitioned in schools without their parents knowing about it, and even without medical practitioners being involved. So there's no pretense that we're ensuring that gender dysphoria of the odd child is correctly diagnosed. After all, only the child knows who they really are, you see, so it's queer theory at work. And the Labor Party has a consistent record of implementing policy that erodes the prerogatives of parents to stand between their children and the queer revolution. The close link between activism and government policy is particularly pronounced here in Victoria, of course, because you have, under the Andrews Labor government, policy development and implementation has been outsourced to activist academics, notably the Australian Research Centre for Sex, Health and Society at La Trobe University. And this has established itself as a kind of nerve centre for LGBT activism and sexuality education. It forms a one-stop shop for research, which then informs the development of public policy, particularly in the Departments of Education and Health, and then is funded by the Victorian Government to implement many of those policies, which is why Archer's annual report reads like a list of accomplishments for the LGBT movement. It includes Safe Schools Coalition, the Rainbow Tick Accreditation Program, Healthy Empowered Youth Grants, which finance the early careers of future activists, and a never-ending stream of research to show that LGBT suffering is entirely the fault of an unaccepting society. This is the abuse of scholarly authority to abuse public trust, and it annoys me because there are serial offenders in this regard. And the latest of these is the report on conversion therapy. Conversion therapy, properly understood, refers to the forced or coerced treatments, including electric shock therapy and various forms of aversion therapy, that are prohibited under the article of the ICCPR dealing with torture. Every right-thinking person, therefore, opposes conversion therapy. But the activists disingenuously conflate faith-based counselling or pastoral activities with torture. Effectively, this aims to quell the ability of anyone to contradict the sexual rights narrative that sexuality is a fixed, immutable part of who you really are and synonymous with your identity. We have quite different views on that, but effectively our views are causing pain to the LGBT community, so therefore we must be silenced. And you will have noticed their naughtiness with language. Safe Schools is an anti-bullying program because anyone with heteronormative views is a sort of bully of an LGBT people. And if heteronormity is oppressive to LGBT people elsewhere, then I've seen activists talk about parents who reject their children, and it turns out that this means that they've just failed to use the right pronouns. It can mean kicking them out of home, but it can just be a slip of the tongue. And given their naughty tricks with language, it's easy to see that conversion therapy might include anything that does not positively celebrate or affirm a self-declared identity. So how will this then play out for the parent, for example, who refuses to use the correct pronouns or allow surgery or hormones? And again, the ALP Party platform at national level is ahead even of the activist academics. A 2015 ALP platform sought to ban religious counselling and acknowledged parents who might take their child for such counselling as abusive. And then the proposed 2018 platform is just much simpler, but it proposes criminalising all so-called conversion therapy. So this would be nothing less than the legal weaponry to prosecute anyone who contradicts the LGBT narrative. Here is a blank check for the state to intervene on any pretext in your family and in the way you raise your children. If the queer revolution wasn't dangerous enough, this has the potential to hamstring parents completely. And it's not just at state level, this is at federal level as well. But we have an opportunity to stop it. You have an election here in a couple of weeks, and this is a good opportunity to remind your government that parents vote.